I think it's pretty widely accepted that the tight end position is the hardest to evaluate in fantasy football. Most people just seek out rankings videos for tight ends and they make those assessments on who they're going to draft in fantasy football for the particular year. But I've been doing some research over the last 10 years that led me to Jonnu Smith last year, which most people know was a league-winning tight end because of the great value you were getting on him. So I'm going to walk you through that research today so we can start correcting the tight ends that we're going to grab in 2025 fantasy football. Just make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So get into the research. The first thing that I wanted to walk through before I went through any of the players on the list or anything like that was I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page for the requirements that a tight end needs to meet to become a league-winning tight end. Because when I say league-winning tight end, I'm not talking about Travis Kelce over the last 10 years. I'm not talking about George Kittle. I'm not even talking about Mark Andrews, who did it several times. Those top-tier guys obviously are league-winning tight ends. But if you remember over the last several years of fantasy football, every now and then you're going to get a tight end like a Jonnu Smith who was a ridiculous value at the position and was a league-winning tight end. So when I was trying to identify what separated league-winning tight ends, well, the first thing that I noticed is that these guys are scoring 160 fantasy points in a fantasy season in a half PPR format. And originally I thought it was going to be my top 5 guys, right? Those are usually the separators, and anything below top 5 is not guys that are making a difference in fantasy football on your overall team. But what I've seen over the years is that a lot of guys are top 6 guys and they have 160 fantasy points, and that's going to make a huge difference to your team. And then the next thing that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with is, again, you need to have a tremendous draft value attached to you. Because the bottom line here is that if you're getting Travis Kelce, you're expecting him to be a league winner. But if you get a Jonnu Smith last year and he hits for you, he's taking you really far in the playoffs, whether you're in a redraft league or whether you're in a best ball format. So I wanted to go through all the guys that I've been studying over the last 10 seasons. And obviously, it's an enormous list. I'm not going through all of these guys on the list right here, but I just wanted to show you like what I've been researching and exactly what I was looking for over the last several years. So obviously I'm looking for the player, the year that they were a top, 5 tight end, top 6 tight end, getting 160 fantasy points in a regular season of fantasy football. I also wanted to know normal stuff, like things like targets, yards per reception, total yards, touchdowns that they were acquiring. And I wanted to also know what their fantasy finish was the year prior, and we're going to get to that a little bit later because that's a clear identifier for us. I want to know the age they were at as well because age is usually a huge defining factor in my research videos. And then I wanted to know the number of top 5 seasons that they've had as finishers at the tight end position here. So again, you can see all those guys on the list right now, and the big takeaways are the main things that I wanted to address, particularly with this group of tight ends right here. So the first big takeaway here is obviously going to be related to the age. And as I just kind of went into briefly, which was that age is obviously a big factor here. And you can see at the tight end position that only Travis Kelce and Antonio Gates crossed the age of 31 and had a 160-point season in fantasy football in a half PPR format. In other words, we're only talking about Hall of Fame level tight ends, like top 10, top 15 tight ends of all time type of category right there. So it's not obviously something that you want to target, being the older tight ends. Like, these are only outliers who are exceeding the age of 31 and still putting up massive fantasy seasons at the tight end position. Now, the next thing, I wanted to look at the age 30. How many guys broke the age of 30 and were able to do it at the age of 31? Greg Olsen, Delaney Walker, Gary Barnidge, and George Kittle were the only guys who broke 30 and had a 160-point fantasy season at the tight end position. So essentially what we're looking at here with this is George Kittle's a Hall of Fame talent. Greg Olsen, I would argue, is a Hall of Fame talent. Delaney Walker, for those of you who've been playing fantasy football for the better part of 2 decades, you know who Delaney Walker is. Not a Hall of Fame talent, but the guy was really, really good as a tight end in fantasy for a long, long time. And then Gary Barnidge literally was the lone outlier. Like, the guy had one good season in fantasy football, and that was it. At the age of 31, he was able to be a stud in fantasy for 1 year. Don't rely on that season from many guys because only Gary Barnidge was the only guy who was able to do it past the age of 30 that was not a consistently really good tight end in fantasy. The next takeaway I had was only 6 tight ends max were eclipsing 160 fantasy points in a given season. So essentially, like I said earlier, the reason I went into it was thinking that only the top 5 guys were going to be the difference makers. I actually found some years, top 6 tight ends in a particular season were getting 160 points in a fantasy football season. So sometimes that's just the big number right there that some seasons can hit, but more often than not, you're going to be around 3 tight ends that are hitting 160 fantasy points a year, or 4 at the most. And then, of course, at very most, you'll have a 6 tight end season where all 6 of those tight ends hit 160 fantasy points. And the last big takeaway I had here was only one tight end had less than 10 yards per reception in this 160 point season, and it was Evan Ingram in 2023. It was actually a pretty ridiculous season he had, because when you actually look at the numbers here, the only reason he was able to do that is because of the ridiculous target volume that he got, having 150 targets basically. So obviously, most of the time, you're not going to want to target a guy who's getting just really short throws and has a low yards per reception here. So last year when I did this video, I stopped there as my big takeaways. But then, of course, we had some more data come in 2024 that gave me 2 more takeaways here. And there was only one tight end that had less than 70 targets on this entire list, and it was Mark Andrews in 2024. Now, it's very easy to remember this because it was just one season ago, but Mark Andrews had like 12 touchdowns in 2024 that, of course, propelled him to a top 6 finish in fantasy football above 160 points in a happy BR format. Again, you don't want to target most guys that are only having, 70 or less targets in a season. That's not smart drafting strategy there. And then only 3 tight ends had less than 90 targets. So again, we're wanting to target volume hogs, and I think that that's a pretty self-explanatory takeaway right there. Now, the next thing I wanted to hone in on really quick before we move on is I wanted to see what the tight end finish the year prior was. And I briefly touched on this because what we're looking for today is not the Travis Kelce's of years past, the George Kittles, right? You're not looking to get guys who have been top 5 studs on a yearly basis, and every single year in a fantasy draft, their draft price is really high. That's not what we're looking for today. We're looking for the next Jonnu Smith to come out of a fantasy draft because they're out there. And the tight end finish the year prior, you can see on a lot of these guys, is top 5, top 6, top 3. A lot of these guys are returning to elite status at the tight end position in fantasy football. So again, we're not targeting those guys because of the fact that they finished so high in fantasy football on almost a yearly basis. Their price is going to be really high in drafts. What we're looking for is guys who finished as a tight end 17, guys who finished as the tight end 13, 15, 14, 19, the year prior to them having that big season, because those are the guys that are going to have really low prices and great values attached to them in fantasy football. So there's a good mix of both right there. So again, I wanted to take those guys out of the equation, the ones who are always finishing as top 5 guys. And I wanted to narrow down the list of guys right here that were either rookies or had really low tight end finishes the year prior to them having a 160-point fantasy season. And you can see the list of guys is much smaller. It's much more digestible right here. You can see exactly what I'm looking for. Basically the same thing as the last list. But the major takeaways I had with this is that all of these guys had less than 100 targets. Now that one is self-explanatory, right? Like obviously, if they all had more than 100 targets, then none of them would be bottom, outside of the top 10 at the tight end position. That just would not happen here. 3 of these guys had less than 10 yards per reception. So it kind of correlates and matches up with the amount of guys that were coming in and having a low yards per reception, but still having an elite season. Overall rule is this. We want to target guys who are above that 10 yards per reception clip right there to be league-winning tight end values. None of these guys eclipsed 650 yards receiving. So that's a big one right there because, again, them having that lower production is going to lower their draft price in the fantasy season that they ended up being great. So there's going to be lots of values there at the tight end position, and only 3 of these guys were older than age 27. So basically what I'm looking for here is that since we have some age parameters, right? No tight end above the age of 31 except Hall of Fame talents, and also only 3 of these guys being older than 27 years old. We mainly want to target guys who are 27 or younger when we're thinking about taking a shot on a later round tight end who has big upside. And 4 of these guys had less than 4 targets per game. So this is, again, going to be a general rule that I want us to follow here when we get into the list of of guys that fit the criteria in 2025. We're wanting to find guys who are having more than 4 targets per game, not less than 4 targets per game in the previous season. So I want to highlight, before I get into the guys in 2025 that fit the criteria, I want to highlight what we're looking for right here. To find a potential league-winning running tight end at a superior value right here, we're looking for guys that were averaging at least 4 targets per game the previous season in fantasy football. So guys who averaged more than 4 targets per game in 2024. We're also looking at guys who had at least 10 yards per reception in 2024 as well. 2 main checkpoints, we got to make sure these guys are checking them off. They need to be below 650 yards in 2024 as well, so they did not have a big season last year, and they also need to be below 31 years old. Now, again, we want to target the guys on the younger side of 27, but we're not going to rule out guys who are 28, 29, 30, because they still can make it happen. Example, Jonnu Smith just made that happen in 2024. So just to prove to you that this works, I ran this last year, and the group of guys that made the list last year was Jake Ferguson, Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz, Jonnu Smith, Hunter Henry, Tyler Conklin, Chikakakwo, Davis Allen, and Luke Musgrave. So obviously, Jonnu Smith was the big hit there, who had more than 160 fantasy points in a half PPR format. If you drafted Jonnu Smith, he was taking you to the playoffs. I had a huge advantage with Jonnu Smith last year, and I'll be brutally honest here, I was not big on taking Jonnu Smith in best ball drafts or in redraft leagues last year. But I took him a couple of times in best ball, and all those teams that had Jonnu Smith, they all made it to the playoffs. So the leverage here that we can get from hitting on one of these late values at the tight end position, if they hit, cannot be overstated. It is enormous what the tight end position could do for us in fantasy football if we're hitting on the right guy. And I'd also add really quick, Hunter Henry last year was a top 12 tight end, so he made an impact based on his draft value at the tight end 18. And Luke Musgrave, if I had just swapped out Luke Musgrave for Tucker Kraft, it wouldn't have been a big hit. But my head was almost in the right place on that one. So that was last year's list, just to prove to you that the criteria 100% works. So the guys that make the list this year, just on a pure basis, hitting all those checkpoints and all those takeaways that we need, is David Njoku, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, Cade Otton, Dalton Schultz, and Noah Fant. Now, you'll notice here, there's spaces in between these guys, right? It would almost indicate that there's some guys missing from this list right here. And of course, that is the case. Because what I did here was I did include guys who did have less than 4 targets per game in 2024, but I love their opportunity in 2025. So those missing pieces are Isaiah Likely, Brenton Strange, Jatavian Sanders, Juwan Johnson, Theo Johnson, and Noah Gray. So those guys add up to the total list right here of guys, which is 12. So all these guys made the criteria to be league-winning values at the tight end position in 2025 fantasy football. Now, obviously, I like guys better than others. We'll get into that just in a second here. But before I even address my personal favorites, I cannot overstate this. If you have a gut feeling on someone, you take them. Because last year, like I said, I did not like drafting Jonnu Smith. But I missed out big on that one because I'd rather take Jake Ferguson last year and guys like Luke Musgrave. I missed out a lot more than I should have on guys like Jonnu Smith because of my own personal preferences. Bottom line is this. If they made the list and they followed the criteria, you take a shot on these guys. With that being said, my 2 favorites, and it's going to be hilarious, Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts. I want to start with Dalton Kincaid and let you marinate on Kyle Pitts here for just a minute. Dalton Kincaid, I think, is arguably also in a similar class to Kyle Pitts in the sense that people are just not looking forward to Dalton Kincaid at all. Bottom line is this. Dalton Kincaid is a great value this year. Tight end 13 in underdog drafts right now with an ADP of 137.3. So the bottom line is if you can actually hit on Dalton Kincaid, and he could be a top 6 tight end this year with more than 160 fantasy points, the value you're going to get from Dalton Kincaid is going to be enormous. Also, he hits every metric. And the guy is also very young as well. And on kind of a prove-it season right now after a really bad 2024. So I think he's got plenty of motivation. Motivation should not be the issue here. The issue is he that good? I personally think he does have talent still. I did not forget the player we saw the rookie year. So I'm personally taking the shot on Dalton Kincaid myself in a lot of drafts. And Kyle Pitts, I want you to marinate on that one for a second. You've had time. Kyle Pitts, it is bizarre that I find myself defending him in 2025 fantasy football because I don't really like him either. Like, honest truth, I am not a Kyle Pitts guy. But this guy has an ADP of 158.1, and he is the tight end 18 in fantasy football drafts on Underdog right now. Absolutely crazy that I'm here defending him. I don't really have much to defend the player, but the bottom line is he made the criteria to a T. This guy, before we added in guys with less than 4 targets per game, was on the pure raw list of guys that made the criteria entirely. Add on top of the fact Kyle Pitts is in a contract season, and this guy has lots to fight for at 24 years of age. The guy is really, really young. So Kyle Pitts, I get it. If you don't want to draft him, I'm not going to advocate that you draft him unless you have a gut feeling as well, like I do this year, that Kyle Pitts legitimately has a chance to be a league-winning tight end this year. I'm drafting him. I have not drafted much of him prior to this video right here, but since I've done the research and I've modified everything, Kyle Pitts will be on my teams in future drafts. Now, let's get into some guys that I can also get on board with as well, but I don't have as much confidence in as Kyle Pitts and Dalton Kincaid. So the guys that I can get in on, David Njoku, Isaiah Likely, Brenton Strange, Dalton Schultz, and Noah Gray. With David Njoku, I just hate the fact that he's got a quarterback carousel. In lots of respects, I think it will be a quarterback carousel in 2025 for the Cleveland Browns. So I'm not as in on him. Plus, add on top of the fact he's dealt with a lot of injuries over the years. Not big on David Njoku at cost, but I definitely see the upside with him being that he's a really good player. Isaiah Likely, I love the fact that he's young. He's on a contract year. He's hungry. He looks great. And Baltimore is a great place for a tight end with Mark Andrews on his way out. I think Isaiah Likely, if they commit to him this year, is easy a top 5 tight end. Obviously, the hurdle right now is Mark Andrews because he's still a dominant red zone threat. So I don't think he's going anywhere, but I do think Isaiah Likely is worth taking in drafts. Brenton Strange, I'm off of him now after I was hot on him at the beginning of the offseason because of the fact that they drafted Travis Hunter. I stand by to the fact that they will give him almost 100 targets, if not more, in 2025. That will eat into Brenton Strange's target share. But let's say that Travis Hunter spends most of his time on defense. If you believe that, Brenton Strange will be eating targets. So he should be on your radar. Dalton Schultz is an interesting one. I don't naturally like Dalton Schultz. I think he peaked in Dallas in one season. But Dalton Schultz is on an offense with tons of changes in the wide receiver room in Houston. Nico Collins is your alpha dog, right? Stephon Diggs is gone. Tank Dell will not play in 2025. You've got 2 rookies who are expected to man the position, if not one, with an aging Christian Kirk on the other side. Dalton Schultz could easily become a league-winning tight end again this year if all of those guys fail to come through on their promise. There's lots of change up here and lots of space for a tight end to emerge in this offense. Dalton Schultz could very well be that guy. And then Noah Gray in Kansas City. Travis Kelce's in his upper 30s. Like, at some point, the dam will break with him, and Noah Gray will become the better tight end. It could be this year, and at the price that you can get him at, I've taken the shot on him in several drafts. I think you should as well because he fits the criteria. And then the last thing I want to run through here is the guys that I don't naturally like. These are the guys that I just think I'm staying away from. I think you should as well, but again, don't listen to me on everything because these guys still fit the criteria. Cade Otton, Jatavian Sanders, and Noah Fant, I don't like them in 2025. Cade Otton because there's just so much target competition in Tampa. I think Emeka Egbuka will become immediately valuable in fantasy. I think there's not much room for Cade Otton. Jatavian Sanders, a lot of guys to fight with as well. And just a guy I don't particularly find to be a compelling prospect at the tight end position at this point. They have Tommy Tremble again, and they drafted another tight end. There's lots of competition in that room. I just don't know if I see him becoming the clear-cut tight end 1, which is pretty much what you need to be to become a really good tight end in Carolina's offense with Bryce Young. And then Noah Fant, I think he's had a lot of time to prove himself. Sam Darnold is not exactly the greatest thrower to tight ends in fantasy football, so I'm just kind of staying away from him. And I'm indifferent on Juwan Johnson and Theo Johnson. So again, If they made the criteria, you should take the shot on whoever you personally believe in your gut is going to be the best player. Because I've given you the criteria that all these unexpected league-winning running backs and the route that they took to become 160-point fantasy studs at the tight end position. To find the next Jonnu Smith, one of these guys is in this list right here, and I gave you who I personally believe it could be, but you let me know who you think it could be in 2025. So again, let me know in the comments below who you think is the Jonnu Smith of 2025, and if you want to see the breakout wide receivers only the smartest drafters are taking right now, click on this video right here.